Well, perhaps as people are coming in, I'll get started. So, of course, I want to begin by acknowledging the First Nations here in Australia. We are here in Canberra on Ngunnawal lands, and of course to pay our respects to elders past and present, and acknowledging Indigenous Australians from all over the country where various people are joining us. And to note that this was stolen land, unceded, and really will never be. So I'm Sharon Friel, welcome to the Saving the World webinar series. I think we've got some of the regulars joining us today. As you know, the webinar comes to you from the Planetary Health Equity Hothouse, an initiative of the Laureate Research, the Laureate Project in Governance for Planetary Health Equity, which is based here in the fabulous School of Regulation and Global Governance. I'm joined with my colleague, Dr. Nick Frank. Nick's one of the Laureate Research Fellows. And as you know, each month we're joined by a speaker talking about the different aspects of the consumptogenic system that contributes to climate change, inequality and poor health. And really, certainly this year, we're having a strong focus on the structural origins of that harmful consumptogenic system, and of course what it means for planetary health equity. One of the really important areas within all of this and the sort of structural drivers is to do with power, it's to do with the commercial sector, it's to do with finance. And we are joined today by, and we're really delighted to be joined by Professor Carol Rhodes. Carol is Professor of Organisation Studies and the Dean of the Business School at the University of Technology in Sydney. And we were just talking beforehand about how Carol, I mean, really it's such a lovely illustration of modelling that academic leadership, both as a dean and still has time to do all of this amazing academic work. Carol's recent books, Woke Capitalism, How Corporate Morality is Sabotaging Democracy, and really just phenomenal outputs. And today he's going to talk about his forthcoming book, and he was just telling us that this is the first outing that he's had, so an exclusive, and the title, which I just think has to win an award just for the title, The Myths of the Good Billionaire. So Carol, really thank you so much for joining us. I think you're going to speak for about 30 minutes and then we'll hand over to Nick for some reflections, and we'll, as always, open up for discussion with the audience. So over to you.
Look, thanks so much. A very generous introduction, and greetings, everybody. I'm talking to you from my office at UTS, which is on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. And I would like to express my acknowledgement of their elders past and present. Much of what I'll talk about today has to do with inequality. And of course, Australia is a land of inequality, especially for Indigenous Australians. I mean, if you think of ongoing colonialism, dispossession, racism, discrimination, has resulted in many inequalities, whether it for Indigenous Australians, whether it be health, life expectancy, employment, income, and wealth. Very relevant today. And of course, this is the year of the Indigenous voice to Parliament. So I encourage everyone to vote wisely in this important occasion. I'd just like to thank Sharon and Nick for this opportunity to speak here and to acknowledge the Planetary Health Equity Hothouse and the great work that is done in kind of bringing academic work to bear on the real problems of the world, not something that happens in all aspects of what we do. So it is great to be here. As Sharon said, I'm going to talk to you about work in progress today. about a book that I'm roughly about halfway through. And I've become interested in billionaires, not just in relation to economic inequality, but to what extent might we also think of billionaires as a political and cultural as well as an economic problem? I mean, of course, economic inequality is growing, and as well as being stratified geopolitically, stratified by class, stratified by race, stratified by gender. And if you like, billionaires are at the apex of this of this inequality. And there's more and more of them every year. And is this where we're coming to? And I'm focusing largely on kind of countries in the liberal democratic world where the billionaires largely exist. Are we creating winner-takes-all societies where there are just too many people in poverty, hunger, and homelessness? And not only in liberal democratic societies, that affects the whole world as well. So this is the work that I'm doing, looking at the social and political power of billionaires, but also I'm interested in how obviously power comes with wealth to some extent. But I think the power of billionaires can't be explained by their wealth alone. And I think culturally, we're often faced with the situation of a moralization of billionaires and a moralization of inequality as a result. And how this then stands in the way of the democratic promise of shared prosperity and human flourishing. I want to be clear from the outset, this isn't about hating rich people. You may recall, those of you in this country, our former Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, used to always talk about the politics of envy, if you ever wanted to talk about tax or anything like that. That's not what it's here. I don't even think the issue really is about rich people. I think billionaires are a symptom of a much bigger problem and not the actual problem themselves. And the bigger problem is the political economic system that produces massive inequality. If anything, government should shoulder the blame for letting this happen rather than billionaires who've taken advantage of it. You know, it's a sign of the neoliberal experiment gone hugely wrong, where, you know, we were promised an era of popular capitalism, promised an era of economic growth that would benefit everybody. And instead, we've got disastrous global inequality and a bloated class of global billionaires. So the work that I'm doing is to try and undermine the moralization that goes hand in hand with this, and possibly to make some small contribution to the possibility of a new moral and political vision for a more just future. And that just future would be one where the wealth created by human activity is shared by the many rather than hoarded by the few. So this notion then of the so-called myths of the good billionaire, I suggest that there are four interrelated myths or mythical archetypes. The idea that the billionaire is a hero, the heroic billionaire, the idea of the generous billionaire, the idea of the meritorious billionaire, and finally, the idea of the vigilante billionaire. And I'll get onto those in a minute. But the idea is that these myths do provide a quite compelling justification for inequality, while actually being not much more than a fig leaf covering a much more dangerous reality. And really the reality here is that we get, you know, setting society back to the kind of feudalism and plurocracy that that democracy, the democratic tradition intended to overflow, a really kind of reversal to worse times, if you will. But just to set the scene a bit, let's look about how big the problem is. Last year, as they do, the World Inequality Lab at the Paris School of Economics produced its World Inequality Report. And they reported that since 1995, the combined wealth of global billionaires had increased 300%. They used to have 1% of the world's wealth, and it moved up to 3%. They also discovered that if you look at the history of world inequality, it has moved back in recent times to the peak levels that it had been in the early 20th century, before the New Deal in America, before the welfare state elsewhere. And if you think of the share of income that is held by the poorest 50% of people in the world, it's back to where it was in 1820. And the numbers are getting worse, especially with billionaires. In 2021, that was the middle of COVID, right? We were kind of addled in the economy was addled by COVID. Not for billionaires. The number of billionaires in the world grew by more than 13% during that time. The top 10 richest people doubled their wealth during COVID, where 99% of the rest of the world was worse off. I mean, in the world now, there are 212 people who have a wealth greater than $10 billion each. If you added all that up for those people, it's worth as much as the annual market value of the German economy. And I think it's fair to conclude that world inequality is widening because of the very rich. Now, it's not just a global thing. If we come back to think of Australia, on average, Australian people, we're the fourth richest people in the world, on average. But of course, you've got to think of distribution. But at the same time in Australia, inequality is getting worse by the year. Economic growth largely benefits top income earners, and inequality is significantly worse in this country if you're Indigenous, if you're a woman, if you're a person with a disability, if you don't have a university degree, or if you're migrant, someone who was born outside of Australia. Australia, there are 139 billionaires, according to the Australian newspaper, and you wouldn't expect them to be lying about this kind of thing. It's the biggest number ever, and their wealth is up 61% since before the pandemic. So that's the kind of thing. So how do billionaires fit into this? So I look at these mythical archetypes, and the first one is the myth of the heroic billionaire. The idea that billionaires are actually heroes, people who are, to be admired. And I'd argue here that the billionaires are, if you like, the heroic protagonists of an American dream gone global. They represent, I would say, a cruel version of survival of the fittest social Darwinism, but they are nevertheless seen as the fittest. And if you follow this myth, then the rich people are to be exalted. And the poor, well, they're just losers in life's game. And I would also argue, and kind of part of the thing going on here is that if you look at neoliberalism and the era of neoliberalism, a term that's kind of so vastly overused, it's almost meaningless, but I'm going to use it anyway. But we can look at the idea of neoliberalism as the globalization of the American dream. But it's not the original American dream. The term American dream was actually coined in 1931 by an author called James Truslow Adams. And it was in a book, a best-selling book that he wrote called The Epic of America. And in his words, he sought to explain the, and I quote, history of the outlook, character, and opinion of the ordinary American. And what Adams suggests is that the promise of America and the promise of American democracy was a promise of freedom and independence, very much opposed to the oppressions of a class-driven Europe, where migrants were coming from. He conveniently didn't talk about slavery or the dispossession of Native Americans. But this is the idea that America and the American dream wasn't about individual success. It was, to quote Adams again, about a richer and fuller life for all. So Adams is railing against the injustices of economic inequality, with an argument that with freedom of America also comes equality and solidarity. The American dream, by this incarnation, it's a collectivist vision where everyone can flourish. It's an essentially democratic dream. But if you think about how the notion of the American dream is used today, it's very different. It was exemplified a little while ago by a guy called Leon Cooperman, who's a former chairman of Goldman Sachs. He's worth about $2.5 billion, not one of the richest, but still a lot of money. And he sees himself as the epitome of the American dream. He was born in New York to first-generation Polish parents, grew up in a one-bedroom apartment, went to public school. And when recently someone asked him what he thought of the American dream, he said, and I'll quote it, It is where the 99% can still join the 1%. It's possible with enough luck and commitment. Now, there's a big shift here between this and what Adams was saying, because what Cooperman's saying, and I think the contemporary version, it's not about that everyone can be successful. It's that anyone can be successful, but only a few people will. So it's a very individualized notion, a very individualized Darwinistic notion, where the solidarity that marked the original American dream has kind of fallen off. And this is a new thing, which I'm associating with neoliberalism. I mean, even if you go back and take the time to read Adam Smith, who's often, rolled out as an apologist for capitalist excess. I mean, that's not true. I'll quote from The Wealth of Nations. The true measure of a nation's wealth is not the size of its king's treasury or the holdings of an affluent few, but rather the wages of the laboring poor. So what happens? Well, today we don't get Adam Smith. We don't get James Adams. We get Donald Trump instead. And in Trump's world, this is the world of winners and losers. And if you're a loser, too bad, that's your fault. And so this is, in this world, the hope that everyone can achieve success is gone. And instead, the idea that inequality is just a natural outcome because some people are more fit to prosper than others. And so the billionaire morality then is one that suggests that inequality of wealth and power is natural and inevitable. We have this globalization of the new American dream, where the billionaire is the hero of this dream, the individual. And if you go back to, the 70s and 80s and look at the reforms that were spawned by Margaret Thatcher in the UK and Ronald Reagan in the US, and really kind of with global effect, this was the new era where the values of individualism and competitiveness began to rule. We were promised trickle-down economics, reward the rich and the corporations and society will benefit. And it was a bogus promise. What we've got is economic growth for sure, but with it comes widening economic inequality. And again, as I said at the beginning, billionaires, in my view, are not the problem here. They're a symptom of this more general malaise. And inequality is part of it. Remember, Margaret Thatcher got her economic doctrine from reading Friedrich Hayek. And he was quite explicit, right, to quote Hayek, the large economic advance that we have come to expect seems in large measure to be a result of inequality and to be impossible without it. So the whole economic doctrine is based on the necessity of inequality. It's baked into the systems that have been created. It's not gone away. It's not a thing from the 1980s. If you look a few years ago, Donald Trump's Tax Cuts and Job Acts, where he was cutting tax for those people earning over $500,000. I'll quote the Donald. I'm going to cut taxes massively. I'm going to cut business taxes massively. They're going to start hiring people. Again, it's a trickle-down economics argument. Same thing here in Australia. Scott Morrison's tax reforms, which are still going through, are geared towards benefiting high-income earners. And the stage 3 tax reforms that the current government's still supporting will do that as well, even though there's an abundance of research that says the last 50 years of global tax cuts have not resulted in any significant effects on unemployment or economic growth. John Quiggin called it some time ago zombie economics, these dead ideas that keep coming back to life when they deserve to be dead. So I'd suggest that billionaires should not be positioned as heroes, but just the side effects of a system that's failed, a failed promise of a better life through economic growth. Kind of let go of the idea that they're heroes. Now, tied up within this hero myth is the myth of the generous billionaire. Now, you may have heard of an institution called the Giving Pledge. It's a philanthropy campaign set up by Warren Buffett and Bill Gates, been around since 2010. where basically they are encouraging billionaires to give away their fortunes. 236 people have signed up. Of course, it's not a legal commitment. People, it's just do-gooding. There are big names on there, of course. Mark Zuckerberg, Barron Hilton, Michael Bloomberg, Elon Musk, new people signing up each year. One of the latest signatories was a couple called Tom and Teresa Preston Werner, who made their billions in the software business. And if you sign up to this thing, you get to go on their website and you write a letter, and the letter is produced on the website. And the letter that Tom and Teresa Preston Werner wrote says, capital should not be hoarded. It should be recirculated and redistributed for the benefit of society and for those who need it most. Wonderful sentiment. But it's not true. Capital is being hoarded more and more and more, even though we're in what some people call the golden age of philanthropy, where bequests to charity from very rich people seem to have escalated. Inequality seems to escalate alongside it. And we have this whole thing that some people call philanthrocapitalism, a kind of, strange marriage of philanthropy and capitalism, where doing philanthropy is about business, and it's based more generally on an ethos that suggests, just as the way these people said, that rich people can save the world, and they can do it by approaches that are entrepreneurial, market-based. But is the world being saved? It doesn't seem so. I mean, it also moralizes the people who are the givers. There's still no such thing as a free gift here. And it really, in many ways, serves to justify inequality by moralizing the very rich. And again, taking us to a more feudal time where the world has to rely on the crumbs that fall from the master's table in order to survive. And of course, all at the master's discretion and without any public accountability. I mean, Bill Gates is a good example here, the founder of Microsoft. He gives away loads of money, largely through the foundation he set up with his ex-wife, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. They've got a $50 billion endowment. They've paid out $71 billion in grants since they started in 2010. It doesn't seem to have affected Gates much. He's still the 5th richest guy in the world. But again, it's all based on his personal morality without public accountability. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation is the second biggest donor to the World Health Organization. Number 1 is the US government. Number 3 is the UK government. Should we have a particular individual on account only that he made loads of money through aggressive business practices and innovation, set the World Health agenda? That's the situation here we have, where billionaires are able to make personal and idiosyncratic decisions about what problems need to be solved in the world and how to go about trying to solve them. Why? Just because they're rich. That's not democracy. There's no public accountability. It is the rule of the rich, plutocracy, masquerading as generosity. So the third myth, then, that we'll get onto is the myth of the meritorious billionaire. This is a defense of billionaire wealth that says, well, rich people, billionaires, deserve all that money because of their hard work and talent. And I think there's 2 dimensions to the problem with this. One is it actually true? Or is being a billionaire more about luck, inheritance, family connections, exploitation, and things like that? And the second one, even if it is true, even if they are deserving of this ridiculous amount of wealth, is that a good thing? Is a meritocratic society a good ideal to have if it results in a winner-takes-all system that ends up justifying inequality? And, meritocracy as a political buzzword kind of came more in circulation through Tony Blair when he was the leader in the UK and Barack Obama in the US, but also in business. It was in 1997 that Steve Hankin from the consulting company McKinsey and Company coined the term war for talent, where there's a war for these super meritorious people and businesses need to compete in it in a battle-like way kind of global meritocracy of the elite. But is meritocracy really the kind of bedrock of democratic and capitalist societies that Blair and Obama would have had us believe? Well, I don't know. We may have a putative equality of opportunity, but we have in actuality very much an inequality of outcomes. And of course, if you believe in meritocracy, again, it's a moral justification for billionaires. It's fine to be filthy rich. You deserve it. By the way, if you're not rich, if you're poor or homeless or hungry, that's not an accident of birth like it would have been in feudalism. It's not a result of systemic disadvantage. If it's a meritocracy, your poverty is your own fault. That is another deeply troubling morality built into meritocracy. So you've got to ask, is meritocracy such a good thing? The term meritocracy, interestingly enough, was coined by a British sociologist called Alan Fox back in 1956. And I got to tell you, he wasn't a fan. He wrote an article called Class and Equality in a journal called Socialist Commentary. So meritocracy was originally used as a socialist critique of a system, a new system of inequality that even back then Alan Fox identified. And he was concerned that all meritocracy does, it replaces the birthright as the basis of inequality, as it had been traditionally in Europe, with talent as the basis of inequality. And he said that's not an improvement. It's still, it doesn't change the system. It just changes who's at the top of the system. It's not creating a more equal system. It's just redistributing the inequality to different individuals. So in a sense, meritocracy is no moral justification for billionaires. The final myth that I'm writing about is the one about the vigilante billionaire. This is here where we get back to some of the more central themes of this group. But you may have seen back in 2021, David Beasley, who's the director of the United Nations World Food Programme, he went public saying that the world hunger crisis could really quite significantly be abated if just some billionaires stepped up and contributed a very small fraction of, the wealth that they had. Now, Elon Musk got word of this, and he went on Twitter and he said, if the UN World Food Programme can describe on this Twitter thread exactly how 6 billion will solve world hunger, I will sell Tesla stock right now and do it. And then he added, but it must be open source accounting so the public sees precisely how the money is spent. Now, Beasley saw this and he thought, right, Musk, I'm taking you up on it. And he tweeted back and he said, first he said, headline not accurate, 6 billion will not solve world hunger, but it will prevent geopolitical instability, mass migration, and save 42 million people on the brink of starvation. Now, so a few days later, Beasley then did actually put the detailed plan of exactly how the money would be used. The total bill came to 6.6 billion. Not true to his word, Elon Musk never responded. And this comes down to the idea that political historian Jill Lepore calls Muskism. And it's the idea that billionaires are like lords of a former era, and the rest of us are like peasants with our fates in their hands. They know best. But what this means is that it subverts regular people controlling their own life. Even so, heroically and mythically, Musk still sees himself as a hero for humanity. But what it means is that his wealth means that he can decide. He can play around with world hunger like a cat playing with a ball of wool. And also the view then is that his personal morality is superior to that of society and its institutions. You got the same with Bill Gates. He addressed the World Economic Forum in Davos in 2008, and I quote, businessmen, yes, that's the word he used, businessmen and businesses are best placed to save the world. That is, to my mind, the sums up this whole problem of billionaire morality. And in a sense, it's like the billionaires being vigilantes. They can bypass governments such an overwhelming conviction in their own judgments that they put that ahead of society, just in the same way that vigilantes do. You got it with Donald Trump. You know, he used to say, I and I alone can fix it to the problems, you know, and draining the swamp and disparaging the whole question of democratic politics with a crazy messianic self-confidence. It's like billionaires seeing themselves as some kind of vigilante superheroes, like kind of Batman almost. Now, and it was the same when Musk bought Twitter. He wasn't just making a business deal. If you remember this kind of talk at the time, I mean, he was saving democracy with doing this. He was a free speech fundamentalist. And even when Musk challenged Beasley, it wasn't just about asking a simple question. He was asserting his power as an individual outside of the democratic social contract. He decides is the bottom line. What happened? Time magazine in 2021 made him Person of the Year, an absolute celebration of plutocracy. And part of this too, it's interesting, you know, Gates used the term businessman, and I don't know if you recently saw Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg on the press claiming that they're going to have a cage fight over Twitter competition. Raewyn Connell refers to the term hegemonic masculinity, and more specifically to what she calls transnational business masculinity. And this is a masculinity based on competitiveness, aggressiveness, independence, where, you know, the government is feminized by, you know, as a nanny state, unnecessary to the alpha male. Government regulation is the enemy, and you have masculinity not through brute physical force, but through the power of capitalist institutions that men lead. In this this world of business masculinity, if women are to be successful, they've got to lean in, as Sheryl Sandberg famously said. They've got to lean into the male system, and that's a system which, according to its own rules, do good and get rich. And I think it's really all part of very much a false conviction, kind of wrapped up in this masculinization, and a false conviction that corporate and market regulation plus tax cuts for corporations and wealthy people will result in shared prosperity and social progress. And instead, what we get is billionaires and inequality. So kind of bringing this to a close, the question is then, what can be done about this? My view is that we need a new moral and political vision for a future where the wealth created by human activity is shared by the many rather than hoarded by the few. I mean, there are practical things that obviously can be done, but part of that, and the small part of my contribution, is about trying to dispel some of the myths of neoliberalism and the myths of heroic billionaires, the myths that, and let's accept that market freedom will not lead to shared prosperity. Economic value is not created by entrepreneurship, it's created by labor. Meritocracy is not a possible or desirable system of distributing wealth. Now, making these statements, I'm not anti-business, I'm not even really anti-capitalism, but we've got to look at how business and wealth creation and the billionaires it's created contributes to society. You know, and there are important contributions that can be made. Business activity can create meaningful and reliable jobs, valuable goods and services, and paying taxes that fund public services. But that's not what we get under the current system. Instead of good jobs, we get precarious employment, economic inequality, and the obscenity of CEO pay. Valuable goods and services, maybe, but we've also got inflation fueled by corporate profiteering, not to mention the COVID profiteering. Companies that pay fair tax, no, we get PricewaterhouseCoopers. So we've built a system that rewards the few very well. And again, it might be easy to blame rich people. I think that's a problem too. That's too convenient. I mean, the answer to these problems is political. I mean, immediate options would involve redistributing wealth after it's earned through tax reforms, wealth taxes, or putting in place systems that would prevent inequalities being created through forms of industry regulation and anti-monopoly focus. I mean, Oxfam have calculated that a small tax on the richest 5% of people in the world could lift 2 billion people out of poverty. And there is a growing tax the rich movement, which is supporting these views. In a sense, views that have been perhaps a little too slowly building steam, even since the Occupy movement, which is really where a lot of the contemporary issues about inequality have been raised. But more generally, I think there's the need to grow awareness of the problem, to create a new public debate, a renewed public will for equality, to retreat from individualism back to values of solidarity. And in the end, it's not about asking whether or not billionaires are good, despite the title of this talk, and despite the myths that suggest they are. It's not an issue of morality of good and bad. This is really an issue of justice. And I think the issue is to change the system that produced billionaires, change the unjust system that produced them. And that is a way to go. And I hope that my work is in some small way making a contribution to this. Thank you very much.
Carol, that was just marvelous. I could listen to you for hours. So really, before we open up for a general discussion with colleagues online, I'm going to hand to Nick. He's got some sort of reflections and questions, I suppose, for you, and that'll kick us off. So yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Carl. I think I've tweaked a muscle in my neck, nodding along as vigorously as I was doing. I'm busy rereading Eric Hobsbawm at the moment, and there were definitely some kind of echoes there when we're talking about feudalism and the kind of liberal democracy as a response to it, and breaking down of those old hierarchies, and then the reemergence of the new kind of hierarchy that in many ways bears a strong resemblance to that feudal system, where you do have this elite class that determines outcomes for billions of people. I mean, a lot of our work up to now has been in the kind of comparative political economy tradition. So one of the things I was particularly interested in is whether or not you thought that the kind of the most aggressive variants of neoliberal capitalism that tend to be found in the kind of the liberal economies, the asset and consumption-driven economies like UK, the United States, Australia, Canada, and New Zealand, differs to billionaires and then their involvement in politics and the economy in different types of growth models. So in places like Germany or Scandinavia, or continental Europe more broadly. So yeah, that was just a kind of question. And then it does seem to me that greater billionaire involvement in politics is actually going to strengthen democracy or democratic governance at all. It does seem to be fundamentally problematic. And I think we've seen, certainly in the United States, the way that the involvement of billionaires has influenced our political processes there. And just kind of tying it back to that kind of comparative element, whether or not we see the same type of thing happening in a Germany or a France or one of the Scandinavian economies. And I was also wondering whether or not you thought that the kind of rise of the billionaire class can be then linked to inflation. I mean, we can certainly link it to inequality. It's a symptom of the system, but I was wondering, do you think that there's any link to the kind of inflation that we've seen, particularly in the last couple of years? Because I think there's certainly an argument to be made. There's data that suggests that at least a portion of inflation is being driven by profit-seeking corporations. And I think I'll leave it there for the moment. I've got a ton of other questions.
Okay, there was quite a lot of questions kind of nested in that, so I'll try my best. I mean, yeah, I haven't really looked at this comparatively, other than to narrow it down. Obviously, bear in mind that if you look at the profile of billionaires, there's loads of information about them. Just go into Forbes magazine website and you'll find loads of fawning and lists of billionaires. The majority of them are actually American. The majority are men, and the most popular location where they live is New York City. So that tells you something of a comparison, but that's not the case. I mean, there are billionaires all over the world. And the connection to politics is really interesting. One observation here would be that there are two. Donald Trump, well, he claims to be a billionaire. No, there's no real transparency about his finance, but let's take him at his word. Why would he lie? He's one example, but another interesting billionaire, Berlusconi was a billionaire who made money. So there's a European connection there, and there are billionaires around the world. So I think it would be different in different parts of the world for certain, and it would kind of be linked to levels of inequality. But on the one hand, it's about kind of counting the billionaires and identifying them. But it's the other hand, it's about the kind of values culturally that the existence of billionaires reinforces. And that doesn't come down just to the work of billionaires. So if you look at the inflation that we're looking at now, which many people would argue is the result of corporate profiteering, not wage hikes, then you'd see this is the same, it's the same kind of, again, using the term neoliberal, which I'm cautious in using, but it's the same kind of competitive individualism that's about, every man, and they usually are, for himself, and you go and do whatever you want. And if you're a corporate who's pricing, that means you price what the market can bear without any concern for its effect on other people. So it's, I think, this kind of individualism the business doesn't have to be informed by, but increasingly has become so at this time. So you've got the billionaires per se and what they do, and then you've got the ideas the billionaires are a symptom of a bigger problem, which affects all of us, if you like. And I think that's part of what really needs to change, and that's why I'm reluctant to blame billionaires. I mean, they've taken advantage of a particular system in many ways, and in some cases, you would have billionaires who are billionaires because of crime and cronyism, but it's about taking advantage of a financialized system. It's about being exploitative. It's about monopoly power and all of these things. But those same values are reflected more broadly across society. They're just kind of exemplified in the billionaires.
So, colleague, so we might open up we'll come back to more questions at this side in a wee second, but we might just give a chance for colleagues who are joining us online if there's any questions or comments. There was a lovely comment from David Wright, just noting your beautiful reframing of the system, Carol. But yeah, please, I encourage colleagues just to either a question into the chat or come off. But whilst I'm waiting to see all of that, I might just sort of pick up if that's okay, and then I'll come back to Nick. Carol, so I really liked when you were sort of coming towards the end, and the idea of sort of reinstating a moral and political vision where, like you've said, sort of wealth is shared by the many. And I fully agree with you of the focus on the system that has created this symptom that has emerged. And it would just be lovely to hear more of your thoughts around, how when we've got such policy inertia built in, when we generally see quite cowardly, I would say cowardly politics in place, when we see all of the short-termism, both within sort of business and in the finance world, and in policy as well, in government policy, it's all that short-term approach. What are some of the conditions, to your mind, that just helps reinstate that vision that you're speaking about?
I mean, I honestly think it will require generational change. And I think if you look at the conditions in Australia, for example, now, where on the one hand, younger people, as and those of us working in universities have the privilege of working with younger people, perhaps more than others, seem to be more politicized in this generation than I've seen at any time in my career. A lot of it's around climate issues, which is relevant to you. I kind of call them the post-Greta Thunberg generation. So I think there is a new generation of more politicized people coming up. And as they grow up, they're faced with, if they go to university, they leave with large debts, and then they go into the world. And if you live in one of the capital cities in Australia, people generally, and unless they have parental wealth to draw on, can't afford homes. And I think that is a real change that's coming on, because often you do need crisis. But the idea of needing a new political vision, I mean, if I think of my own life, I was born in 1967. I went to university in 1984, and I went to Cardiff in the UK, in South Wales. Remember, that was the heart of the time of the miners' strikes, where Thatcher was really kind of doing her worst. But if you look at the changes that we're in now, that was the turning point that's led to many of the dominant values, particularly political economic values that we have today. And that was a huge change. And in a sense, it was a response to stagflation problems in the 70s and a variety of other things. But things really changed significantly since then. But so it needs to be something as significant as that. It's kind of on the horizon. I was quite enamored when the Occupy movement came up, but that seemed to kind of ebb. I was quite enamored when I saw Bernie Sanders talking about socialism on the American TV, which, was remarkable even a few years ago. And so there's lots of these kinds of signs. And I think it's a question of seeing where they grow. But often, big change doesn't come unless there's a crisis. The New Deal in the US didn't come about until the crisis of the Great Depression. But hopefully there can be something more positive. But I'm afraid, and I'm cautious about making comments about this too, because it's easy to want to get into the position of kind of producing some glib answer. But then I'd be just as bad as the heroic billionaires who think they can solve all the world's problems, because I'm telling you, I can't.
No, thank you. But I suppose it's so important though to have like you've done an informed consideration of some of the pathways forward, because otherwise we're just stuck with the demise of humanity as we know it. But so we've got a couple of questions. So